Hi, this is Carol. I decided to do a video diary to record my journal entries for the project. This is me reflecting on week number one. So, coming into class, I was really nervous about it because I don't really have any dance background and I don't really have any great memories of dance. I remember a few years ago, one of my friends was an instructor at the Live for Dance, I believe, Brock Club, and a few of my friends went over to support her. And I remember I was trying out the choreography, and I just felt so silly the whole time. And there's a big mirror where you can see yourself, and I just felt really self conscious about it. And so I haven't, ever really had a great impression with dance, and I've never had any experience talking about it in the classroom as well. So it was definitely very nerve wracking going into the class, and I wasn't sure what to expect. So the first activity that we did was the shell activity, where we picked out a shell and we made up a dance move that related to us and also the shell that we picked, and then we shared that in a large class circle. So I thought that that was really cool. It definitely was not as nerve wracking as I thought it was, and I think part of that was knowing a lot of my classmates from drama, and I think also just being able to see everyone else do their moves and how everyone else reacted so positively towards them made me feel like I was able to do it and that I wouldn't face any judgment towards it. So I really enjoyed that activity, and I think that it would be really good as an icebreaker in the classroom because it helps students to, just be able to make connections with themselves with the dance move, which the curriculum talks about. And I think it would be really cool if they were able to tie in some part of their culture or ethnicity as well, and be able to make a dance move, or maybe based on their family history or just something about themselves. I think it would be a cool way to be able to share a part of themselves with the class, as well as just an icebreaker for dance. And I think that it helps to think of dance less as choreographed dance as we know it, and more about movement and being able to move our bodies in a way that is expressive and creative, which I thought was very cool to be able to do. The second activity that we did was the wave activity, where we linked arms, we each walked forward, and then we had people drop off and do the dance moves that we did in the first activity, and then the wave would come back and pick them up. And I thought that was also a good activity to be able to connect with our peers. And I think, the fact that we were able to do that together and do those movements together made it less nervous when we were performing. I also think it was cool that we went through some of the creative process through it as well, because we did do a bit of revision after we generated the idea and then we performed. So I thought that was interesting to see that creative process, even though it was just a short period of time, and you could definitely drag that out even with your students when you do it. The third activity we did was making a dance sequence using the different types of sequences. So I believe my group chose a ronda, and then we chose a cat and mouse, I believe, for our dance sequences. So I thought that was a really cool way to incorporate some of those types of sequences in dance and be able to create something, again, using the moves that we had in our first activity. I think if you had just told me to choreograph a dance and come up with a few different sequences, it would have been very overwhelming. So I think having that scaffolding from the first activity and then the second, and then adding this into the last one, made it a lot less intimidating. I also think it was easier to plan with my peers because we had, again, that scaffolding. It wasn't as difficult to come up with a completely new dance sequence, and we were able to have our ideas flow a lot better, and everyone was kind of in charge of their own moves. So I think that would be very good, again, as an icebreaker group activity for your students, just to get them used to working with each other and sharing their ideas, and learning how their ideas can go together and create a dance sequence. This activity, I also liked that you could very easily incorporate a lot of those musical elements in as well. Like, for example, ronda was something that we learned about in music. So I think if students were doing that in music and creating their own verses and rhythms and beats, that maybe they could incorporate a dance move in there as well, and then perform that as an entire dance sequence or an entire dance performance. I think that would be very easy to do a cross-curricular with music. I really liked from this first class was how we talked about the importance of having a very safe and respectful classroom environment. And I think that's something that you would really need to talk to your students about the first dance class or drama or arts class that you have, of just having that classroom environment where everyone feels safe to be able to perform those things without the fear of being laughed at by their peers, or having them, say that they're a bad dancer, things like that, and just having comments that are critical but also respectful. So I think we really, again, it goes back to knowing your students and being able to talk to them openly about these things, and also ensuring that if there are situations that come up where, for example, a student is laughed at because of a certain dance move that might not be the best dance move ever, that you address that with your students as well and make sure that behavior doesn't continue, and that students feel safe and very welcomed being in that environment, because I feel like dance is so vulnerable, and really with any of the arts I feel like it's very vulnerable because a lot of kids don't feel that they are confident in it, and it's a lot to be able to ask a kid to sing or dance or draw something in front of the entire class. So it's really important to get students out of that comfort zone, but also ensuring that they feel safe to do so. So the first activity that we did in the second week was the activity where it was I can dance blank, and we had to dance different parts of the solar system. So it was things like, I believe, hot, cool, rocky, smooth, so different elements that were found in the universe. And I thought this was a really cool cross-curricular activity that you could use maybe with younger grades. And it would be a way to introduce different elements from science into it, and even geography. You could do maybe like hills, you could do lava, you can do rivers, things like that. One challenge that my group had was the difference between acting out the element and dancing it. So we had a bit of confusion with using movement to demonstrate those things and actually acting those out like we did in drama, because they're both using movement. So I think that would be something that you would really need to teach your students, and again, scaffold them into it. So maybe starting with just one element and giving them a demonstration, having them all do it, and then having them choreograph their own sequence. I also liked that we were only supposed to pick 3. So I think that if we had to pick any more or any less, it might have been overwhelming or it might have been too easy. So I thought 3 was a good number to be able to do. And then I liked how we had to incorporate the different elements of dance. So I believe we used levels and pathways. So that was a good way to remember those different elements and incorporate them into our dance. And I think it really gives your dance meaning. So I enjoyed that as a first activity. So the second activity that we did was where we had to create a dance sequence that was able to represent 3 facts about the planet. And I think that it was very memorable because now I remember 3 things about Jupiter that I wouldn't have known before. And it's definitely a cool way where I think you can introduce concepts to the class. Maybe in younger grades, you could use that more incorporated with science. I think when you get into older grades, some of the topics might be too complex to be able to do dances like that. But I think, again, it would be a good introductory activity and just, a fun way to be able to get interested in those topics as well. Thinking about how you could modify some of these activities for students that have hearing disabilities, like we talked about in class. And in one of my other classes, they talked about how they had different technology that they used. So, for example, talking into mics or having special hearing aids for the students, but something that all students in the class could use. So, for example, having a mic that all students in the class could use to talk, which would benefit students that just have a quieter voice, but would also be able to include the students with audio disabilities. So I think that that would be a good incorporation and consideration into activities like this. I think that if you had a student who had a hearing disability, maybe something like choosing a song with a very strong bass line might be able to help, or maybe even playing a video in the background where there is, how do I explain, like where there are graphics that move with sounds might be helpful for them as well, just so they have an audio aspect and not just, that they have a visual aspect and not just the audio aspect. And finally, I wanted to talk about one of the activities we did, which was Lead with Your Blank, and we had to dance in a group where we had to lead with a certain part of your body. And I was just thinking how that would be really cool maybe in a biology class. If you're learning about different parts of the body, you could have even students dictate which parts of the body you had to use and take turns leading that, but they would use the actual scientific terminology of that part of the body. I think that would be a really cool way to incorporate science and biology once you get into the older grades. So this week we decided to focus on math and drama. We were asked to tie in different dance strategies that we had learned into math strands. So I really enjoyed that we were able to talk through our thought process and run through our ideas with the class. I really liked that we were able to do a trial and error with the class and try out different strategies just like we would in a classroom, so we could see if these things would actually work. So one example was when one of the groups decided to do an activity about area, and they had the chair set up, and we were just talking through as a class what would work, what wouldn't work, and then when we tried the activity, we saw that some people were just confused with the instructions and standing outside of the boundaries if they're supposed to stand inside. So I think just being able to go through those things with the class was really helpful, and to do it in a classroom where it felt very safe and it was okay to make mistakes and okay to have things not work out the way they were supposed to. That was really special to be able to do that and yeah, work out those strategies with the rest of the class. We decided to do an activity about angles and using the strategy dance like a blank. So we used the different sizes of angles. So we used obtuse, acute, and then right angles. And we had the class dance the way they thought an obtuse angle would dance, for example, which was like very large movements. And that was really fun. I'm not sure if I would use that strategy with maybe the older grades like high school, but I think maybe with like intermediate and elementary, it would be a good way for us to wrap up the unit or even introduce some concepts in a way that's less intimidating. And for students who are kinesthetic learners, I think it would be really helpful because they could really see and memorize those movements. So I know that a lot of students get confused between, for example, obtuse and acute angles. I think having a strategy like that where you're able to actually have movements that are corresponding with what you think that word means could be very helpful for memorization. And again, if you use that to introduce a unit, I think it could be a good way for them to feel confident going into the unit as well. Focused on in this class was about rotations, and so we were asked to create a dance where we used all of the three different math concepts that have to do with rotation. When I was working with my group, we kind of struggled with we had to remember the differences between all of those different math concepts. And then think of like how we would apply them. So for instance, my group had 5 people, so it was a little difficult because we partnered up, but Diana was the one person that didn't have a partner, so we had to figure out a way to integrate her into the dance where we could still show, for example, symmetry even though we had an odd number of people. So I think that was good, very challenging. I think that if we were doing that in a classroom, I might just make sure that people are in even groups if we're doing an activity like that. But again, it was a good challenge. So I think for students who want that extra push, it was a good way to think of how we could integrate someone into the dance in an odd number and still be able to demonstrate those math concepts. I think it aligned with the math expectations about rotation. And I think it also was a good way for us to even, again, learn those concepts. And if it's a good thing for us to learn and memorize, I think that it would be very helpful with the class. Even as a wrap-up unit, maybe before the test, to do this as an activity, I think would be very helpful. Benefit to that activity was that when we were in our math class, one student said that she had trouble imagining those concepts of rotations and translations and symmetry in her mind, and so she needed to draw them out. So I think that would be a very helpful way for students who also struggle with that to be able to imagine those concepts in real life and using 3D objects, and especially when you're moving with your body, again, like the other activities that we did. For kinesthetic learners, it can be very helpful with memorization, and for also be very inclusive for students with exceptionalities because it takes very complex math concepts and it turns it into something more simple. So for example, a student who has a learning disability might not be able to do the same level level of translations or symmetry that other students are able to do. However, in this kind of activity, they are still able to play with the idea of symmetry and translation and rotation, even if they can't translate the same kind of complex questions on paper. They're still able to play with those ideas, and the rest of the class benefits as well because they're able to push the boundaries of what they think those concepts can be. So I think it's a very UDL approach to learning and can be very easily modified for students who have exceptionalities. I enjoyed the class. I liked, being able to be a bit silly with my peers and be able to try different strategies. I don't know if I would use all of those strategies in the classroom, again, just because it does take very complex ideas and makes them very, very simple. So I think for me, teaching a JI class, they might need more complex math concepts than that in order to hit the curriculum. However, I do think it is a fun introduction activity. I do think it is fun to introduce some of those concepts to the class and to be able to hit some of those curricular expectations. I think, again, it would just come back to knowing your class and knowing your class profile, seeing that if they would benefit from these types of activities, if they are really kinesthetic learners, if they like to move their bodies, if they see math very visually. I think it just comes back to knowing your class and seeing if these strategies would be helpful. But I really enjoyed it. I had a lot of fun. And again, I think one of my favorite things was just being able to talk out these ideas with my peers and try them out in a place where I didn't feel like we were judged for making mistakes. This week in class, we did how to incorporate dance into geography and social studies. So the first activity that we did was to make a lesson that uses the geography curriculum that also ties into the dance curriculum using the dance strategies that we've learned in class. So my group made a lesson where students were going to be assigned a province and they have to make a dance sequence with that province. So for example, for BC, they would have to do something like mountains and like move their body like a mountain. And then they have to perform it together so that they can see the Canadian landscape. So we'd have like BC all the way to Nova Scotia and PEI, and then students would be able to see their dance sequences performed together. So it'd almost be like an A, B, C, D, E, F, G all the way through all the provinces. And then we decided that we wanted to incorporate Canadian music. So Jen came up with the idea of using Stompin' Tom music. It was a good idea to incorporate the Canadian music because I think we talked about in our group how sometimes when we just focus on like the movement, it can feel a bit like drama. And so bringing in that music and that cultural piece can really tie it into social studies, but also just make it feel like more of dance. The activity that we did could easily be accommodated to different grade levels. Students can do different ideas that grow in complexity as we reach the older grades. So for example, you could point out different aspects of the province as they get into older grades. The one consideration I would have of this is, of course, just to be mindful of the music that we're using. In class, we talked about what is a cultural appropriation versus cultural appreciation. So I think just, again, being mindful of that, being mindful of the fact that students have different backgrounds and what it means to be Canadian can be different for each student. So really, again, it all comes down to knowing your class profile and knowing your kids and just knowing what would work for them. Touched on this week was Bernstein's theory of creativity. So the ones that I thought resonated the most with dance was imagining, body thinking, and synthesizing, and thinking about how we can use those tools in dance class. So for body thinking, in dance, we communicate ideas with our bodies, and so this might give us a different perspective on how concepts are expressed. For example, we might think about how we can use our bodies to express geographical ideas in social studies. And so this gives us a more meaningful connection to the material, especially if students are kinesthetic learners. They can develop deeper connections using their body thinking versus, just like thinking of things in their heads. It will just help them to visualize. Speaking of visualization, this also goes into imagining, which is another part of this theory. We imagine because we need to translate our ideas into reality. So it forces students to turn what they have in their heads into real life movements. Some students might struggle with this aspect of dance if they struggle to use their imagination. So a way that we could help students differentiate if they do struggle with this is to help them think of concepts in terms of words rather than pictures. So I know some people in my life where they don't really think of life in pictures, they think of life in words. So I think giving students the option to imagine how they connect to different concepts using words instead of just pictures is a way that we can help them grow in their imagining. This part of the theory that I thought connected well with dance was synthesizing, so just summarizing what we've learned. I think, for example, when you take any concept and try to turn it into movement, so if we're talking about trying to think of the physical landscape of a province and turning that just into a few movements, it really takes a lot of synthesizing and summarizing what we've learned in class. And it really forces you to think of the material that you've learned and how you can apply it. And again, use your imagination, use your body thinking, and incorporate all those things into the movement. So you're not just like regurgitating ideas, you're really thinking through a lot of the concepts and processing them through body movement. The activity that we did was the dance recipe, and our group did the tsunami. So we had trouble thinking of words for our recipe and how to differentiate them from each other. So, for example, Alex kept mixing up like size and height and trying to have different concepts that created a recipe that weren't too similar. We also struggled with the flocking, and we didn't really understand how that worked in our group. And obviously, we didn't have a lot of time, so there wasn't a lot of time in class to explain it. I think if I was doing this activity again with my students, I would definitely scaffold the different steps by demonstrating them. So, for example, I think I would talk to them about word recipes, have them create the word first, then talk to them about flocking, and then how they can add that into their dance sequence that they've already created, and just scaffolding in that way, I think, would make it a lot more manageable. I think I would also just show them and demonstrate the flocking in a dance. I think always providing an example is really good for students. Again, I know that we didn't have a lot of time, so we weren't able to do that, but I think always giving an example for your students to follow can really help those students who struggle to understand instructions. For this activity, I would also use the description section of the critical analysis process that's in the dance curriculum. So, for example, I would have them analyze and make observations about tsunamis, which is what our group did. And then I would have them describe what a tsunami is and then use that in their dance. I think that would be helpful, and again, goes in with that scaffolding. So students are asked to brainstorm and list what they see in the words. That's part of the description. So I think doing that activity first would be a good way to incorporate the critical analysis process, but also scaffold the activity for the students. My last entry, I decided to do a reflection on how I've grown in my pedagogy teaching dance from the beginning of the course all the way to the end. So one point of reflection was that at the beginning of the course, I thought dance was about choreographed movement and learning different styles of dance, and that's how I saw teaching dance, was teaching different choreographies. But now after taking this course, I see dance more about moving your body as an expression of yourself, your culture, the things you are learning, the things you're reflecting on, and as an expression of different concepts. Just almost the same as writing an essay, a way to express your ideas. Another form of reflection was that I've learned dance is about the creative process, and it is a form of sharing your ideas about cultures or ideas similar to art or drama. So in the creative process, it talks about observing, describing, and then making a piece as a reflection of what you've learned. So I see dance more of that, like I said before, as a style of expressing your thoughts and ideas. Also didn't see how dance could be utilized in other subjects before the beginning of the term, but now I see how it can be incorporated into almost any subject, and I think seeing us being able to do so many cross-curricular activities as I reflected in my other week has really shown me that you can bring dance as an activity into other curriculums, and it doesn't have to be just a standalone thing that you teach to your class. I've seen how it can be helpful to kinesthetic learners and especially students with exceptionalities. It's another modality of expression, and that can be a breath of fresh air for the kids who need it. So for kids that struggle with writing or sitting down or visual arts, things like that, this is a way that they can express their ideas, and it can be really good for them in a way that they can learn different concepts for people that don't learn how students normally do. Be very helpful for students with exceptionalities, and as we talked about a lot in this term, even students who have a hearing disability. I think it's cool that they can still practice movements and still participate in dance through different means, such as feeling a beat or looking at different choreographies, or even being able to follow a group of students. I think that that's really cool that they're able to do that, and that's something that I learned this term. My final reflection would be I've learned how to take dance, incorporate into other subjects. I've learned how it can be an expression of thoughts and ideas, and I've learned how it can be useful for students with exceptionalities and students who are kinesthetic learners, but also just, a UDL approach that would be beneficial for all students. So it was a very fun class. I enjoyed it, and hopefully I'll be taking some of the ideas that I've learned into the classroom.